Um, 364 days of the year, I'm the brand director of 442. One day I get the challenge from Jasper and the branded team to fit football into an hour. Even in a World Cup year, I don't get more than an hour. Shocking. Joining me for the keynote, we've got two parts. First is a keynote interview and then a panel. We've tried to fit as many diverse perspectives of football as we can into that hour. Our first guest is Darren Bailey. Darren has been the FA Director of Football Governance and Regulation since March 2009. He's formerly a solicitor and a specialist sports law practice in London, representing various sports clients, including the International Tennis Federation and the Six Nations. He became the first in-house legal counsel at the International Rugby Board, the IRB, where he developed the worldwide regulations of the sport and oversaw all legal work associated with the 2003 and 2007 Rugby World Cups. At the FA now, he's got responsibility for discipline, tough gig, anti-doping, integrity, equality, child protection, financial regulation, and on-field and off-field regulatory matters. So he's a very busy man. He's a member of the Sports Betting Integrity Panel that produced the Parry Report in 2009. Was co-chair of the European Union Export Group on Good Governance, which covered match fixing, good governance for sports bodies, player agents, and the transfer system. But I knew Darren before all of that. The Darren that I knew was a law-studying, combative central midfielder of distinction, and I was the bulldozing centre-forward and sports science student for Birmingham University. So last night was the first time we caught up in 24 years and shared a beer. I think this session is apt to kick off with, because I think, and not just for football, I think the integrity of football and the integrity of any sporting contest is at the heart of the relationship between the fan, the club, the player, the governing body, the broadcaster, and the sponsors. So if the integrity of the contest disappears, the value of the sport disappears very quickly with it. So I think this is such a critical session to kick off with, because it underpins everything else that we're going to talk about over the next 2 days. So, Darren.
Andy, of all the places.
Welcome.
Of all the places.
Of all the places, of all the bars in all the world.
Here.
Not your first time to Singapore. Welcome back.
No, it's great. It's great to be back again. I've had some interesting times in Singapore. As you indicated, in my previous life, I was at the International Rugby Board, and one of the challenges, perhaps a unique challenge really, was to actually try and generate a global regulation for a sport that had turned professional overnight. So many meetings held in Singapore trying to unite the Northern Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere, with new emergence through Asia and some of the East. Fascinating times, and then perhaps a little bit more rock and roll times, and people may forget actually, but with a commercial vein in mind, that in the lead up to the Rugby World Cup 2003, we actually took away the hosting rights from New Zealand as a result of their inability to develop or comply with certain commercial requirements that we had. So interesting times in the build up to the 2003 Rugby World Cup as well. But I do remember Singapore very fondly, despite all of that.
Well, welcome back. Let's talk now about your role at the English FA. Give us a bit of insight into the scope of the role, the size of the team that you have, and the various organisations that you'd engage with on a daily basis.
My team is around 40, and we have responsibility for the issues that you identified, which are growing all of the time. I think what's interesting is now that the notion of governance is shifting. We talk about broadcasting shifting, we talk about all of the other aspects of sport shifting. Governance is shifting hugely. It's now a much more consensually based driven business. There's no clunking fist with the governing body above that's telling everybody what to do. It's almost like winning the battle for hearts and minds, forming more partnership orientated approach around collective interest and shared interest. And as you've indicated, in a sense, there's nothing more shared than protecting the integrity of sport, protecting the integrity of football. I'm always struck by the emotions and the guys who are pulling our heartstrings when they put the clips together. But the reality is those clips matter because those events are credible, they matter, and everyone hangs on the outcome of those. So for me, that's the reason why we're here. Integrity is pivotal.
Okay, on the operational side of things, starting with sort of proactive prevention work that you do, I'd imagine that a lot of the time is spent around education within the player groups.
Yeah, that's another key aspect with the way in which governance is evolving. I think in the past, governing bodies have always been there to pick up the pieces, deal with the disciplinary hearings, deal with the implementation of sanctions and enforcement. We're much more now about upfront compliance, encouraging prevention. It may sound twee, but it's absolutely fundamental. It's much better for us to communicate very clearly, very early, what we expect of people, and how we expect them to conduct themselves rather than being trapped into falling foul of our regulations. And so my duty and obligation, if you like, is to actually just to communicate what's acceptable, to make sure we do that in the right way, at the right time, and with the right people. Because, again, the idea of sending out a telephone directory of rules and regulations is gone. We need to be much more creative and opportunistic in the manner in which we communicate with our players and our participants. And it's worth stressing that we just don't talk about the playing community. We talk about all of our participants. We form a regulatory role, from managers to directors, from players to coaches, from medics. Everybody is wrapped into our regulatory regime, so we have a broad range of participants that we have to get to.
And all club employees now, that's right.
Indeed, yeah, club employees as well. And a big part of our intervention is to actually go out and talk directly to the clubs. And what I'm pleased is now the professional clubs don't just send in their first team coaches, they are increasingly sending in their entire staff. And what's great about that, for me, is that it's actually getting that culture of compliance tuned in from top to bottom. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. We don't just deal with the implementation of betting rules, but we deal with issues such as inside information. And inside information can actually be known to a whole series of people throughout a club. If one thinks about next manager markets, for example. Now, in the past, those issues have been part of the chat of football. But as football has evolved into a global betting product with the ability to create and take bets on virtually any different market, that inside information has more value. So again, shift the culture along, slow interventions, but communicate to all those people who may be affected so there are no surprises for them.
And do you focus your attention on a particular group of players? Like in your view, is there a level of player that's more susceptible to illegal approaches to fix matches or spot fix?
It's interesting. You talk to different people in different sports, and they'll focus on the youngsters, and they'll focus on those that are leaving the game who perhaps no longer have a tremendous interest in it. But there are also other things that are perhaps unseen. If you've looked at the different jurisdictions and different territories, if a person is in debt, they're more susceptible to being approached. If a person has an addiction, they're more susceptible to being approached. So it's got to be a bit more of a sophisticated approach. Now, clearly what we are looking to do, given the changes that have occurred in the betting market, we are looking to target youngsters because the next generation is key. They have to go through specific mandatory education, so we do focus on that group. But I think we're not complacent, and we don't take our eye off of the ball. We are quite keen to make sure that we get to all of the relevant people. And in this context, I think you shouldn't lose the sight of the wider governance impact. There are certain territories within which players routinely go without being paid for long periods. If you go without being paid for a long period of time, you're building up resentment to your club and to the game, and therefore you might be more inclined to do things that you really oughtn't to. So I think within the English game, our quite tight fiscal and financial arrangements actually provide an unforeseen insulation to some of those risks and pressures which may not be present in other territories.
Because the temptation, obviously you'd like to think that the English Premier League is sort of beyond approach, really, because the guys are earning such big sums of money. But at that lower tier, semi-professional conference, League Two, is that where you see potentially the danger points? I
think if one looks at it in a pure common sense analysis, the inclination may be greater to accept revenues for things for doing the wrong thing, that if you're not actually earning a lot of money from the game. But that's what we've tried to attack as part of our educational messages. It's this notion of collective responsibility, and it shouldn't matter where you are within the football pyramid. You make your cash, you generate your memories from actually being responsible for the whole game. And I think what we're trying to do is move away from that me situation and get to this idea that we all have a collective responsibility. We should all report things. We should all do the right thing, wherever you may be in the pyramid. The notion being that English football is fantastic. Why would you want to blow it? And also, just being pure, how do you want to be remembered? Your responsibility, your career, your reputation. Those things aren't necessarily part of people's first up thinking, so our culture needs to sort of evolve in that way.
I remember I listened to an interview you did on Radio 5 Live where you talked about you actually enjoy seeing players appeal for a throw-in in a non-dangerous area of the pitch because it reassures you that the contest is still genuine.
I think that's part of the essence of the English game. I think a lot of people think we're a bit crazy that we actually just appeal for absolutely everything. But that desire and will to win sort of exemplifies the fact that every element, every aspect of the game, whether it be a throw-in or a corner, absolutely matters. And the idea of everyone being seen to drive forward enthusiastically to try and do that is key. And even commentators now, I think, are adjusting their perception. You know, they no longer say, oh, well, actually, it's not fair that he's appealing when he knows it doesn't come off him. They actually want to win, and actually performing to the best in every aspect and dimension of the sport is key to what we're about. And all of the people that sell the sport in this room, I think, need it to stick around. So long may it continue.
FA have recently released 3 short films on the website. We'll show the introduction to those at the end of this chat. One of them focuses on Simone Marina, who reported an approach by a teammate in a Serie B match to the Italian FA, resulted in 17 arrests. Is an individual player's willingness to report approaches in that manner like probably your best chance of controlling it?
I think if you've looked at the cases that have occurred across all sports, the easiest and most straightforward way is if you've got someone who's actually prepared to explain what's gone on. Sometimes it can be quite difficult spinning together the evidence that you require in order to demonstrate something on a circumstantial basis. So we think that it's important that those people that have the privilege to participate in the game essentially have a collective responsibility to communicate and report issues that go on within it. Now, Simone is a fantastic example. There's a guy who had a very difficult case to deal with, but actually was brave enough to do it. And you look at him and he talks about, how could I look my wife in the eye? How could I look my kids in the eye when he's actually had this approach, if he had gone through with this stuff? And so you hope that wider level of responsibility is something that's going to be present in future generations of players, and they'll get it. So showing Simone coaching young kids at Aston Villa just demonstrates the impact that you can have, and that longer-term responsibility to the future generations of the game to keep it real and make sure it continues to matter. So we think that kind of film sort of says more than words.
Yeah, and do you think at that player level there is still a little bit of naivety and ignorance among players as to what actually constitutes match fixing, as in it might not actually be fixing the match, but an event within the match?
I think one of the things that we've tried to do is explode all of those myths and say that actually any aspect of the game is an integral part of it. It goes to make the whole. But I think it's a question of getting your interventions correct. I could sit here and talk to a group of young players and probably have limited impact. If I get the right person communicating that message at the right level, speaking their language in the way that they understand, and we can put quite high-level interventions in play. What I was pleased about when we launched our new betting rules on the 1st of August, there was a high level of media interest. They're interested because we're producing films, and it's easy, it's impactful, it's not a rule book, it's not dry. And so I think in that way, I've got more confidence that the guys will understand it and actually appreciate the messages, and also their collective part as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the other sides, obviously, is the early warning signals that you get in terms of detection. I mean, where do they come from? And can you give us some insight into the sort of external organisation you work with in that detection process?
Yeah. Well, I'm pleased to say, actually, the UK is quite advanced in relation to this area. In 2005, there was a Gambling Act introduced, and as part of the licensing conditions, betting operators had a duty to report suspicious betting activity to sports governing bodies. Now, for reasons that I won't bore the room with, a lot of those guys ended up going offshore and therefore outside of that licensing regime. Now they're all coming back onshore with an adjustment to the law. So there is actually a legal obligation, if you're licensed, to actually communicate and report that activity. But in any event, we decided that was fine for a domestic market, but given the global nature of English football, we decided that we would get a specific company that monitors betting markets for us all over the world. So if there is a suspicious activity, that will be introduced and brought to us. But it's also important to recognise that through our integrity unit, which we specifically established to actually create a single conduit through which all information could be provided to us and to build up an intelligence database in relation to football. We receive information from overseas betting operators, overseas regulators. We'll also receive information from UEFA and FIFA, other national associations. And so we actually have a whole series of interventions coming in. So we hope that we're going to get a better picture. And the Gambling Commission in the UK, which is the body that's responsible for regulating the betting industry as well as sports betting, is also a great filter. And they have a conduit role to play between law enforcement and the sports governing bodies. So I think the national platform we've created in the UK is actually a good one. And I think what we're now seeing is a much more sort of joined up approach and a coordinated approach than perhaps we've seen in the past. And I think that helps.
I mean, on the betting companies, sticking with that, given the proliferation of them into the game at all levels, sponsorship of clubs, governing bodies, media coverage of the game, and does that create a difficult line for you to tread with them? You know, are they part of the problem, but potentially part of the solution as well?
They're undoubtedly part of the solution, and I think we need to be really clear in this debate, is that betting on sport per se is not a bad thing. In fact, younger generations of people want to engage in that activity. They see it as an integral part of sitting down watching a game. They want to be able to bet on it. So key message for us is that betting in itself is not a problem. It's when it becomes suspicious or promotes illegal activity. But looking at it very obviously, the betting operators have no real incentive for there to be strange things going on in the market. They have an equal incentive to make sure that what is going on is correct and straight, because they don't want to be exposed either. So I'm pleased to say again, we've formed very strong relationships with betting companies. They are prepared to provide us with information, but we also try to make the best of what we have. In the past, I think there's been too much tension between sport and betting companies, principally based around this notion of a fair return for the use of sports data. But if you can get past that and start to look at the integrity issues, we have a very strong conversation and a group that sits around the table every 3 months with law enforcement, betting operators, sports governing bodies, and the Gambling Commission, all trying to work out how we can more effectively work together, how we can use the existing legislation. So it's an example of actually what can happen when the sport starts to talk with the other people to come up with a joined up approach. Because unlike most other aspects of sports governance, sports bodies can't do this on their own. It needs a slightly more sophisticated approach.
And do you work with them? I mean, obviously there are certain markets that lend themselves more to spot first throw in, first corner markets. Do you work with them on potentially removing some of those markets?
Yeah, the approach taken in the UK is for us to demonstrate to the Gambling Commission that these bets represent a significant level of risk. So it's done on a risk basis. But I personally think, from an integrity point of view, one can make a compelling justification that certain markets oughtn't to be offered. But I think there are other types of markets which also cause levels of concern, which include, for example, betting on youth football, which for me instinctively feels not something, whether or not there's a risk associated with that is one matter, but from a pure reputational point of view, it doesn't feel right that should take place. I think those conversations will develop and evolve, and I think a lot of the heat has been taken out of it by the shifting into an integrity discussion away from a more commercial and fair return discussion. People will be familiar with some of the stuff that goes on in Australia, where there is a contractual relationship between sport and the betting operators, which gives those sorts of rights and a revenue return. The French model is very similar as well. In the UK, we're not quite at that stage yet.
And do you believe, just trying to get an appraisal of your sort of feel for the extent of the problem, I mean, do you believe that there are matches or periods of matches being fixed in England that are escaping detection?
My sense on that is I don't think there's much more that we can do in order to detect whether that sort of activity is going on. We monitor the markets. We have very close relationships with betting operators. We throw out huge educational campaigns to our players. If there was something going on, I'm confident that we're now in the best position we ever would be to know about it. So I think we're in a really good place now. Okay.
Looking further afield, obviously, English football is now the world game, the global sport, particularly the Premier League. How are you working with other international governing bodies to assist them in their efforts to combat match fixing, specifically in Asia? Are you sharing best practice here, and how's that unfolding?
I think it's important that we recognise that this is not a national issue, and it does have a huge international dimension. And it kind of manifests itself in many different ways. Just in a European setting, for example, UEFA funds an integrity officer in each of the 54 national associations. So that creates a network of information exchange. They routinely meet in order to exchange ideas and thoughts and share best practice and operational practice. FIFA are increasingly moving into that space as well, and they provide information exchanges too, because a lot of it is about intelligence. A lot of it is about information. You need to be aware of what's going on in the marketplace. We are looking to build our links within Asia and within the Asian betting markets to ensure that we're better informed about what is going on down in this part of the world. And I do think that through the international dimension, FIFA as well as UEFA, there will be an exchange of best practice. One final intervention is that in a European context, there's going to be a new convention on match fixing, which is being promoted by the European Council. My sense is that will be used as a basis to move into a more international dimension. I think Australia are particularly interested in that particular sort of intervention because it demonstrates that there needs to be a free exchange of information. And that's partly one of my biggest issues about this whole area. A lot of the legislation that you see in various territories is built on non-sport specific approach. It's tailored to data exchange and information that relates to the general day-to-day life. It doesn't actually deal with the specificity of sport. And if I've got a plea that I would make, it would basically, in whatever territory it is, free up the information if you are a participant within a sports setting, let's look at some of the anti-doping equivalents where it is possible to exchange that information more freely. And that kind of cross-border exchange, information share and cooperation, I think, will be essential to maintaining a global integrity protection link, I think.
And is that cross-border but also cross-sport?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, we've recently introduced rules that allow us to exchange information across sport. Intelligence needs to be in a position to be shared carefully, not in a cavalier way, but there will be issues that go into a cross-sport setting. In fact, we've recently introduced a piece of legislation into our statute books which allows us to recognise sanctions that are imposed by other sports bodies in an integrity space in football. And that's the type of creativity that one now needs in that regulatory setting, because people do engage in activity outside of football as well.
Okay. Darren, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, so you got fantastic insights there, not just from a football perspective, but for all sports. Darren's here for the duration, so I'm sure very open to you picking up anything over a coffee or a beer tonight. As I said, as Darren sort of leaves the stadium, we prepare for the panel. We're going to show the introduction of one of the 3 videos that the FA released in August onto the website. We'll also tweet on the Sports Matters hashtag the link to the FA website where you can view all of these, but we'll show you the introduction. But just before we do that, please, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to Darren Bailey for the English FA for joining us. So if we can roll the video, Darren will stay, then we'll have the panel ready for the panel discussion straight after that. Thank you.